The following is an excerpt from the book, The Fire from Within, by Carlos Castaneda. I had arrived in the city of Oaxaca, in southern Mexico, on my way to the mountains to look for Don Juan. On my way out of town early in the morning, I had the good sense to drive by the main square, and there I found him, sitting on his favorite bench, as if waiting for me to go by. I joined him. He told me that he was in the city on business, and that he was staying at a local boarding house, and that I was welcome to stay with him because he had to remain in town for 2 more days. We talked for a while about my activities and problems in the academic world. As was customary with him, he suddenly hit me on my back when I least expected it, and the blow shifted me into a state of heightened awareness. We sat in silence for a very long time. I anxiously waited for him to begin talking, yet when he did, he caught me by surprise. "Ages before the Spaniards came to Mexico," he said, "there were extraordinary Toltec seers, men capable of inconceivable deeds. They were the last link in a chain of knowledge that extended over thousands of years. The Toltec seers were extraordinary men, powerful sorcerers, somber, driven men who unraveled mysteries and possessed secret knowledge that they used to influence and victimize people by fixating the awareness of their victims on whatever they chose." He stopped talking and looked at me intently. I felt that he was waiting for me to ask a question, but I did not know what to ask. "I have to emphasize an important fact," he continued. "The fact that those sorcerers knew how to fixate the awareness of their victims. You didn't pick up on that. When I mentioned it, it didn't mean anything to you. That's not surprising. One of the hardest things to acknowledge is that awareness can be manipulated." I felt confused. I knew that he was leading me towards something. I felt a familiar apprehension, the same feeling I had whenever he began a new round of his teachings. I told him how I felt. He smiled vaguely. Usually when he smiled, he exuded happiness. This time he was definitely preoccupied. He seemed to consider for a moment whether or not to go on talking. He stared at me intently again, slowly moving his gaze over the entire length of my body. Then, apparently satisfied, he nodded and said that I was ready for my final exercise, something that all warriors go through before considering themselves fit to be on their own. I was more mystified than ever. "We are going to be talking about awareness," he continued. "The Toltec seers knew the art of handling awareness. As a matter of fact, they were the supreme masters of that art. When I say that they knew how to fixate the awareness of their victims, I mean that their secret knowledge and secret practices allowed them to pry open the mystery of being aware. Enough of their practices have survived to this day, but fortunately in a modified form. I say fortunately because those activities, as I will explain, did not lead the ancient Toltec seers to freedom, but to their doom." "Do you know those practices yourself?" I asked. "Why, certainly," he replied. "There is no way for us not to know those techniques, but that doesn't mean that we practice them ourselves. We have other views. We belong to a new cycle." "But you don't consider yourself a sorcerer, Don Juan? Do you?" I asked. "No, I don't," he said. "I am a warrior who sees. In fact, all of us are los nuevos videntes, the new seers. The old seers were the sorcerers. For the average man," he continued, "sorcery is a negative business, but it is fascinating all the same. That's why I encouraged you, in your normal awareness, to think of us as sorcerers. It's advisable to do so. It serves to attract interest. But for us to be sorcerers would be like entering a dead-end street. I wanted to know what he meant by that, but he refused to talk about it. He said that he would elaborate on the subject as he proceeded with his explanation of awareness. I asked him then about the origin of the Toltec's knowledge. The way the Toltecs first started on the path of knowledge was by eating power plants, he replied. Whether prompted by curiosity, or hunger, or error, they ate them. Once the power plants had produced their effects on them, it was only a matter of time before some of them began to analyze their experiences. In my opinion, the first men on the path of knowledge were very daring, but very mistaken. Isn't all of this a conjecture on your part, Don Juan? No, this is no conjecture of mine. I am a seer, and when I focus my seeing on that time, I know everything that took place. Can you see the details of things of the past? I asked. Seeing is a peculiar feeling of knowing, he replied, of knowing something without a shadow of doubt. In this case, I know what those men did, not only because of my seeing, but because we are so closely bound together. Don Juan explained then that his use of the term Toltec did not correspond to what I understood it to mean. To me, it meant a culture, the Toltec Empire. To him, the term Toltec meant man of knowledge. He said that in the time he was referring to, centuries or perhaps even millennia before the Spanish conquest, all such men of knowledge lived within a vast geographical area, north and south of the Valley of Mexico, and were employed in specific lines of work: curing, bewitching, storytelling, dancing, being an oracle, preparing food and drink. Those lines of work fostered specific wisdom that distinguished them from average men. These Toltecs, moreover, were also people who fitted into the structure of everyday life, very much as doctors, artists, teachers, priests, and merchants in our own time do. They practiced their professions under the strict control of organized brotherhoods, and became proficient and influential to such an extent that they even dominated groups of people who lived outside the Toltec's geographical regions. Don Juan said that after some of these men had finally learned to see, after centuries of dealing with power plants, the most enterprising of them then began to teach other men of knowledge how to see. And that was the beginning of their end. As time passed, the number of seers increased, but their obsession with what they saw, which filled them with reverence and fear, became so intense that they ceased to be men of knowledge. They became extraordinarily proficient in the seeing, and could exert great control over the strange worlds they were witnessing. But it was to no avail. Seeing had undermined their strength and forced them to be obsessed with what they saw. There were seers, however, who escaped that fate, Don Juan continued. Great men who, in spite of their seeing, never ceased to be men of knowledge. Some of them endeavored to use seeing positively and to teach it to their fellow men. I'm convinced that under their direction, the populations of entire cities went into other worlds and never came back. But the seers who could only see were fiascos, and when the land where they lived was invaded by a conquering people, they were as defenseless as everyone else. Those conquerors, he went on, took over the Toltec world. They appropriated everything, but they never learned to see. Why do you think they never learned to see? I asked. Because they copied the procedures of the Toltec seers without having the Toltec's inner knowledge. To this day, there are scores of sorcerers all over Mexico, descendants of those conquerors, who follow the Toltec ways, but don't know what they're doing, or what they're talking about, because they're not seers. Who were those conquerors, Don Juan? Other Indians, he said. When the Spaniards came, the old Seers had been gone for centuries. But there was a new breed of Seers who were starting to secure their place in a new cycle. What do you mean, a new breed of Seers? After the world of the first Toltecs was destroyed, the surviving Seers retreated and began a serious examination of their practices. The first thing they did was to establish stalking, dreaming, and intent as the key procedures to de-emphasize the use of power plants. Perhaps that gives us a hint as to what really happened to them with power plants. The new cycle was just beginning to take hold when the Spanish conquerors swept the land. Fortunately, by that time, the new Seers were thoroughly prepared to face that danger. They were already consummate practitioners in the art of stalking. Don Juan said that the subsequent centuries of subjugation provided for these new Seers the ideal circumstances in which to perfect their skills. Oddly enough, it was the extreme rigor and coercion of that period that gave them the impetus to refine their new principles. And, owing to the fact that they never divulged their activities, they were left alone to map their findings. Were there a great many new Seers during the conquest? I asked. At the beginning, there were. Near the end, there were only a handful. The rest had been exterminated. What about in our day, Don Juan? I asked. There are a few. They are scattered all over, you understand. Do you know them? I asked. Such a simple question is the hardest one to answer, he replied. There are some we know very well, but they are not exactly like us because they have concentrated on other specific aspects of knowledge, such as dancing, curing, bewitching, talking, instead of what the new Seers recommend, stalking, dreaming, and intent. Those who are exactly like us would not cross our path. The Seers who lived during the conquest set it up that way, so as to avoid being exterminated in the confrontation with the Spaniards. Each of those Seers founded a lineage, and not all of them had descendants, so the lines are few. Do you know any who are exactly like us? I asked. A few, he replied laconically. I asked him, then, to give me all the information he could, for I was vitally interested in the topic. To me, it was of crucial importance to know the names and addresses for purposes of validation and corroboration. Don Juan did not seem inclined to oblige me. The new Seers went through that bit of corroboration, he said. Half of them left their bones in the corroborating room, so now they are solitary birds. Let's leave it that way. All we can talk about is our line. About that, you and I can say as much as we please. He explained that all the lines of Seers were started at the same time and in the same fashion. Around the end of the 16th century, every Nagual deliberately isolated himself and his group of Seers from any overt contact with other Seers. The consequence of that drastic segregation, he said, was the formation of the individual lineages. Our lineage consisted of 14 Naguals and 126 Seers, he said. Some of those 14 Naguals had as few as 7 Seers with them, others had 11, and some up to 15. He told me that his teacher, or his benefactor as he called him, was the Nagual Julian, and the one who came before Julian was the Nagual Elias. I asked him if he knew the names of all 14 Naguals. He named and enumerated them for me, so I could learn who they were. He also said that he had personally known the 15 Seers who had formed his benefactor's group, and that he had also known his benefactor's teacher, the Nagual Elias, and the 11 Seers of his party. Don Juan assured me that our line was quite exceptional because it underwent a drastic change in the year 1723 as a result of an outside influence that came to bear on us and inexorably altered our course. He did not want to discuss the event itself at the moment, but he said that a new beginning is counted from that time, and that the 8 Naguals who have ruled the line since then are considered intrinsically different from the 6 who preceded them. Don Juan must have had business to take care of the next day, for I did not see him until around noon. In the meantime, 3 of his apprentices had come to town, Pablito, Nestor, and La Gorda. They were shopping for tools and materials for Pablito's carpentry business. I accompanied them and helped them to complete their errands. Then all of us went back to the boarding house. All 4 of us were sitting around talking when Don Juan came into my room. He announced that we were leaving after lunch, but that before we went to eat, he still had something to discuss with me in private. He wanted the 2 of us to take a stroll around the main square, and then all of us would meet at a restaurant. Pablito and Nestor stood up and said that they had some errands to run before meeting us. La Gorda seemed very displeased. "What are you going to talk about?" she blurted out, but quickly realized her mistake and giggled. Don Juan gave her a strange look, but did not say anything. Encouraged by his silence, La Gorda proposed that we take her along. She assured us that she would not bother us in the least. "I'm sure you won't bother us," Don Juan said to her, "but I really don't want you to hear anything of what I have to say to him." La Gorda's anger was very obvious. She blushed, and as Don Juan and I walked out of the room, her entire face clouded with anxiety and tension, becoming instantly distorted. Her mouth was open and her lips were dry. La Gorda's mood made me very apprehensive. I felt an actual discomfort. I didn't say anything, but Don Juan seemed to notice my feelings. "You should thank La Gorda day and night," he said all of a sudden. "She's helping you destroy your self-importance. She's the petty tyrant in your life, but you still haven't caught on to that." We strolled around the main plaza until all my nervousness had vanished. Then we sat down on his favorite bench again. "The ancient Seers were very fortunate indeed," Don Juan began, "because they had plenty of time to learn marvelous things. Let me tell you, they knew wonders that we can't even imagine today." "Who taught them all that?" I asked. "They learned everything by themselves through seeing," he replied. "Most of the things we know in our lineage were figured out by them. The new Seers corrected the mistakes of the old Seers, but the basis of what we know and do is lost in Toltec time." He explained, "One of the simplest and yet most important findings from the point of view of instruction," he said, "is the knowledge that man has 2 types of awareness. The old Seers called them the right and the left side of man. The old Seers figured out," he went on, "that the best way to teach their knowledge was to make their apprentices shift to their left side, to a state of heightened awareness. Real learning takes place there. Very young children were given to the old Seers as apprentices," Don Juan continued, "so that they wouldn't know any other way of life. Those children, in turn, when they came of age, took other children as apprentices. Imagine the things they must have uncovered in their shifts to the left and to the right, after centuries of that kind of concentration." I remarked how disconcerting those shifts were to me. He said that my experience was similar to his own. His benefactor, the Nagual Julian, had created a profound schism in him by making him shift back and forth from one type of awareness to the other. He said that the clarity and freedom he experienced in heightened awareness were in total contrast to the rationalizations, the defenses, the anger, and the fear of his normal state of awareness. The old seers used this to create polarity to suit their own particular purposes. With it, they forced their apprentices to achieve the concentration needed to learn sorcery techniques. But the new seers, he said, use it to lead their apprentices to the conviction that there are unrealized possibilities in man. The best effort of the new seers, Don Juan continued, is their explanation of the mystery of awareness. They condensed it all into some concepts and actions which are taught while the apprentices are in heightened awareness. He said that the value of the new seer's method of teaching is that it takes advantage of the fact that no one can remember anything that happens while being in a state of heightened awareness. This inability to remember sets up an almost insurmountable barrier for warriors, who have to recollect all the instruction given to them if they are to go on. Only after years of struggle and discipline can warriors recollect their instruction. By then, the concepts and the procedures that were taught to them have been internalized, and have thus acquired the force the new seers meant them to have. End of passage. For more about the Toltecs and the new seers, check out the book The Fire from Within by Carlos Castaneda.